Hi everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the old world. It's been a few weeks since we've looked at alternate figures that can be used to get our armies on the table so that we can actually play Warhammer The Old World. Unfortunately, good old James Workshop is still not pumping out the models that we want to see to get our armies out there, so if we want to use anything other than Bretonnians or Tomb Kings, assuming we can get our hands on those models and they're not sold out, as they generally are, along with most of the Age of Sigmar range, we're going to be having to look at alternate figures. So let's today turn our attention to Wargames Atlantic. So Wargames Atlantic, they've been around for a few years now and they produce a range of 28mm plastic figures. These are a combination of historic, fantasy and sci-fi models. Now, whilst the ranges are expanding, I would say they're nothing like complete at the moment. So they are, if you're getting them, figures you're probably going to have to mix and match with figures from other ranges. So bear in mind these are 28mm, and from my experience with the Halflings, and I'll come on to talking about the Halflings in a bit more detail as we go on, I have found that they don't really match up brilliantly with, say, the Mantic figures. They're a little bit smaller. They're a little bit weedier. And whilst if you're just using some of the arms, for example, for conversions, they kind of sit okay, I think if you had a mixture of properly made up models, they would look out of place against each other. Something to bear in mind as we go through. As for how they compare with Warhammer figures, either the official fantasy figures or even, I guess, against Warhammer 40,000, I think it's likely that these guys will be smaller. Warhammer figures tend to be a heroic 28/32mm scale, and these guys, they just aren't. So they are going to be a little bit smaller than those figures produced by Games Workshop. Again, something worth bearing in mind. But we've waffled on long enough about this. Let's have a look at some of the ranges. And I think the most obvious place to start is the classic fantasy range. Now, they have a couple of box sets available which support most obviously the Tomb Kings, in that it's a box of skeleton warriors, and they also have a box of combined skeleton cavalry and chariots. Starting with the skelly infantry, we get a box that is 32 figures for the princely sum of £25. It is important to note though, if you're buying multiple boxes, 3, 5 or 10, discounts are available. So if you're buying a lot of figures in one foul swoop, then you are going to be able to pick them up cheaper. And that's worth bearing in mind if you're thinking about third-party providers as well. So if you're buying through a Wayland and Element Games or something like that, if you're buying a lot, if you go direct, actually you might start to see better discounts by doing it that way. Just something worth bearing in mind. Now, while I've said these skeletons seem to support Tomb Kings, they are slightly different in their style. These guys are very much inspired by Greece. And a box set allows you to build 24 spearmen, 8 swordsmen, 8 pikemen, 8 bowmen, or combination thereof up to the maximum of 32 figures. So they're not going to fit in brilliantly with an ancient Egyptian sort of theme like the Tomb Kings do. However, if we are applying a bit of Egyptian history to our Tomb Kings, they could be representative of the Sea Peoples, which came over and caused quite a lot of chaos with ancient Egypt. So they could be some kind of force along that sort of lines that have been incorporated into your force. There is narrative options, I think, for you to blend them in. Obviously, they could also be used as forces for your vampire counts, if that's what you want to do as well. The other box set which works with potentially Tomb Kings is the Skeleton, Cavalry and Chariot. So what you get, this is a box of £30 and it will get you 10 horses and a couple of chariots. So up to 10 cavalry, up to 2 chariots with crew. And the blurb says you get up 25 foot and mounted warriors. The combinations stated are 1 chariot and crew, 8 cavalry and 8 foot warriors, 10 cavalry and 10 foot warriors, or 2 chariots, 6 cavalry and 6 foot soldiers. Models being equipped with bow, javelin or sword, and options for full command. So I think if you're looking to get sizable units, particularly of chariots, you'd be wanting to pick up multiple copies of this box. From an aesthetic point of view, I would again point to these guys not really looking particularly ancient Egyptian in style. It does make me think perhaps more of a Homeric Greek style again. So much like the Skeleton Infantry, you're looking at maybe a Sea People's influence rather than the Khemri ancient Egyptian sort of style. So something that's worth bearing in mind if you're looking for that pure aesthetic in the style that Games Workshop have provided. These guys will look very different against anything you get from the Warhammer range from Citadel Miniatures. Let's move on now, and the models available to support everyone's favourite football hooligans, the Orcs and Goblins. At the moment, 2 box sets available here. There's the giant spiders and there's a box of goblins. Now, looking at these goblins, they look, I would say, a lot more Tolkien, or a bit like the Cruel Boys, I think they're called, from Age of Sigmar, in style, rather than something Games Workshop produced. They're definitely not those sort of copies which you see perhaps other manufacturers coming out with, or models which are heavily inspired by Citadel. They have very much their own look. So this box set again is coming in at £25 and will provide you with 30 models with the options of spear, bow and various hand weapons. One thing it does say is this set can be combined with the giant spider box in order to be converted to spider cavalry. So you can use them for your forest goblin spider cavalry if that is what you would like to do. Looking at the picture of the sprue, I would suspect that some of the figures, some of the parts are going to be a little bit fragile. I say this because from the models that I have purchased, not goblins, there have been some fragile bits, particularly spears, so care and attention is needed when cutting things out of the sprue. Just as a side mention for the spiders, which I won't show for the arachnophobes out there, the box gives you 12 giant spiders and 12 smaller spiders and some sci-fi parts as well, so you can use them for other things should you choose to do so. The spiders coming in at £25. Again, discounts are available. Turning to one of the armies of legend, the Lizardman, for again a £25 box set, you get 24 multi-part figures. Now these, to me, they look closest to a form of skink, and they can be armed either with sort of sword and spear, sort of fantasy style, but they also can be armed with muskets and rifles, so could be used for a variety of different games, either for your Warhammer forces if that's what you want to do, or possibly as sci-fi forces if you want to incorporate them into something like Warhammer 40,000, one-page rules, something like that. So there's definitely some options there depending on what you would like to do with them. Of course, even armed with muskets, then they potentially could fit in as counts as, if that's what you'd like to do for your Warhammer Lizardman force. That then brings us on to the forces of the Empire. So let's start with the Halfling Militia. For £25 you get 40 models. And they come armed with a combination of bow, slings, halberds and pikes with full command options. And you do get on every sprue a standard, a sword and a horn, so you can use them for conversions if you've got, say, as I have, the Mantic models, which don't come with those command options. You can use those arms in order to make good that difference and make sure that your units all have command squads. So that's something I've been doing across Cavalry and across Infantry to make sure I have units made up the way I want them to be. As I say, I have found that some of these spears, they are very thin. So cutting them out and then taking off mould lines and burrs and stuff like that, it requires quite a bit of patience and a little bit of care just to make sure that nothing gets broken. I should perhaps point out as well that you don't get bases in these box sets, and my understanding is that's pretty true across the board with Wargames Atlantic, so you will need to buy bases separately, either through Games Workshop, I suppose, if you want their plastics, or through one of the many other providers that provides MDF or other material bases. The final box to talk about from the Classic Fantasy range is the Landsneck Ogres. And these come in at £25 for 9 figures. So yes, you could potentially use these as Ogre Kingdom models or as unit fillers really for Empire forces, a larger based model taking up, say, 4 figures for a human rank, and they'll tower above that and look fairly impressive. I think that's quite a classic look. It is worth noting, again, these figures do come with stuff that you could use, such as grenades and auto guns, so they could be used in a sci-fi environment as well, possibly as Bullgrins, Ogres, something like that. So it's a box set that does have options across the games you might want to use and supplement them for. I think it is also worth mentioning some of the other ranges that are available and might be relevant to Warhammer Old World collectors. The Renaissance range covers conquistadors and Aztec warriors, and I have seen a lot of people talking about using the conquistadors as Telians and Stelians. This is 24 models for £25, and they come equipped with a mixture of spears, swords, halberds, crossbows and muskets. There's also some options for pikes and two-handed swords, so quite a blend of things you can build them as. So if you want a slightly different looking force, as I say, maybe a Stelian, something like that, then these could be the figures for you. As a bit of an aside to all the fantasy stuff, I will talk about the Deathfields range very briefly. So this is very much an expanding range that's being made available, and are basically sci-fi twists on historically inspired forces. So for example, you've got Le Grognards, which are generally French Imperial Guard from the Napoleonic Wars, but could also be made up to represent the French soldiers of the Western Front in World War I, or those that fought in Vietnam. Wide range of weapon options available. Now, the Grognards, I think, are worth calling out specifically because they are the most complete of the types of infantry and other stuff available in the Deathfield range, because they've got an infantry box, they've got a command/artillery box, and they've now got some cavalry. Looking at the cost, so 3 boxes of 24 figures each for 70 quid, for example. If you wanted to do an infantry Imperial Guard army for Warhammer 40,000, I think these would represent really good value. And actually, for the Imperial Guard army, I'm starting to think about possibly doing, well, I say possibly, I'm aiming to do in the second half of this year, get about 1,000 points painted by Christmas is the aim. I'm looking at using Wargames Atlantic models purely because that cost saving is quite useful And the figure I have painted up, which is from the Ura set, basically relatively modern US forces made a little bit sci-fi. The model went together quite well. It's painted up really nicely. The figure I'm using, actually, I've put it on a base with some bit of scenery on it, and I'm using it as a Kaldus assassin. Very happy with the way that figure has come together. So what are my overall conclusions? So based on the models that I've physically purchased, played with, seen, I think they are pretty nice models. They don't have tons and tons of detail on them, but they seem to paint up pretty nicely. The lack of bases that come, well, the lack of bases coming with the boxes is a bit disappointing, but I think if you're using them for Warhammer The Old World, it's highly unlikely that they would come with the right bases anyway, even if they were so coming with those things. So you'd need to buy those separately anyway. Not perhaps as useful as a comment if you're looking at using these figures for sci-fi or part of the sci-fi range for Warhammer 40,000, where they probably would, if they were coming with bases, be something that would be usable for Warhammer 40,000. I think a 20mm circle on those infantry would be what you'd perhaps expect, certainly given the pictures on the box art as well. Personally, I'm having fun building and painting up the halflings, and if you've seen the Battle Standard Bearer floating around in other videos that I've done, that is a Wargame Atlantic figure, purely done with a homemade banner. Admittedly, the banner's not come out particularly well, too much glue on the paper, it's soaked through and wrecked the colours a little bit, but you can't have everything, I suppose. So to conclude, I think Wargames Atlantic figures do offer good value. I think if you're looking at buying multiple boxes of the same thing, it's really worth doing the maths and comparing your chosen supplier with the actual website for Wargames Atlantic, because it is possible, if you're buying enough boxes of the same thing, you're actually going to come out with a better deal going direct. Probably not always true. That will depend how many boxes you're buying, but again, that is something to bear in mind. If you do have an interest in using these figures for Warhammer 40,000 and an interest in that particular game, you might want to check out friends of the channel Epic Flail and Incursion Tactics, who produce some really good videos on these topics. Links will be in the description down below. All that remains for me to say, however, is thank you very much for watching. I am returned to the old world. Have a great day.